Welcome everyone to the first part of the social psychology unit. Let's jump in. All right, so social psychology, what is it? A little introduction here. It is the study of how our behavior is influenced by social situations. So the presence of other people, different social contexts, how do those different factors impact how we behave? Some questions that social psychologists ask: how does behavior differ between situations? So if you have social situations that might be stressful, or large social gatherings, or maybe small intimate gatherings, how does our behavior differ between those different types of situations? How can we influence behavior for the better? That is sort of the question at the heart of almost every subfield of psychology. And lastly should we focus resources on social causes of disorders? So let's say there is a social cause that we can pinpoint for a particular mental disorder. Should we focus resources on changing that, reducing that? Well, if we can, absolutely. So let's jump into this a little bit here. And let's start with attribution theory. Attribution theory is based on how we attribute others' behavior. That fact right there, how we attribute others' behavior, will influence our perception of that person. So attribute means how we explain. So how we explain other people's behavior will influence our perception of that person. Will influence how we think about that person. We're going to explore this idea a little bit more here. So if we attribute someone's behavior to the environment, the situation that they're in, we are going to think about that person differently than if we explain their behavior by saying that's just who they are, that's their personality. That is a big distinction to make when we are trying to explain or attribute someone else's behavior. That person acted that way just because of the context, just because of the situation they were in, or that person acted that way because they're a jerk. They're always a jerk, and they always will be a jerk in every situation. So how we explain other people's behavior is going to have a huge impact on how we view that person. Now, we talk about two different types of attributions in attribution theory: situational and dispositional. These are kind of just fancy words for what we were just talking about on the previous slide. If we attribute someone's behavior to the situation, that is a situational attribution. If that's the case, then we kind of say to ourselves, that's not who they are as a person. That's just how they acted in that particular circumstance. That is a temporary state. They are not like that in every single situation. So let's say they were a jerk. Maybe you would explain that by saying, well, they were just a jerk because they were really stressed out that day. That's a temporary state. They're not always a jerk. That's a situational attribution. A dispositional attribution, this is where we say we're explaining their behavior. We are attributing their behavior as a personality trait. They acted like a jerk in that situation because they are a jerk. They were a jerk yesterday, they'll be a jerk tomorrow. They're a jerk in every single situation. It's a part of who they are. That's a dispositional attribution. So we've got situational and dispositional. Situational, they acted that way just because of the situation. Dispositional, they acted that way because that's who they are. Now, that's attribution theory in a nutshell. How we explain people's behavior influences how we view that person. Now, it gets a little tricky when we start to attribute our own behavior, when we start to explain our own personal behavior. And this is where we have to talk about the fundamental attribution error. This is an error that we all make. It is human nature to misattribute our behavior and others' behavior. So let's talk about this error a little bit. The fundamental attribution error occurs when we attribute others' behavior. So when we are explaining someone else's behavior, we tend to overestimate dispositional attributions and underestimate situational attributions. So to say that a little differently, when we are explaining someone else's behavior, we tend to overestimate that they are acting that way because that's who they are. That's a part of their personality. We tend to underestimate how the situation affects their behavior. So when we see someone else acting like a jerk, we tend to say to ourselves, that person is a jerk. It's not just the situation. They were a jerk yesterday, they're a jerk today, they'll be a jerk tomorrow. It's part of their personality. So that's one half of the fundamental attribution error. When we are explaining someone else's behavior, we tend to rely on personality dispositions. We explain their behavior by saying that's a part of their personality. Now, the other half of the fundamental attribution error is when we attribute our own behavior. So when we are explaining our own behavior, we make a distinction. If we did something positive, so if we engaged in positive behavior, maybe we won a race or won a sporting event or got a really good grade on an exam or in a class, or you got a new job with a high paying salary. If we do something positive, we tend to overestimate personality and underestimate situational factors. So if we do something good, we tend to think of ourselves as, oh, well, that's just who I am. I'm a good person. I'm successful. I'm really strong. I'm really fast. So, yeah, of course I'm going to engage in that behavior. Of course I'm going to win the race. Of course I'm going to get that job. And we tend to underestimate the situational factors that may have helped us achieve that positive behavior. The exact opposite is true when we are explaining our own behavior, but something bad happens. Let's say we came dead last in a race. Let's say we didn't get the job. Let's say we got a bad grade in a class. If that's the case, we tend to overestimate the situation. Well, I didn't do well on that exam because the professor made it really, really hard. Or I didn't get that job because the person who was hired, that's the son or the daughter of the person who runs the company. Or, I didn't win the race because, well, I was just a little sick before. So this is the fundamental attribution error in a nutshell. When we explain someone else's behavior, we tend to rely on dispositional attributions. But when we are explaining our own behavior, it depends. If it's positive behavior, we will overestimate dispositional attributions. If it's negative behavior, we tend to overestimate situational attributions. So it might sound a little confusing now. There is a YouTube video explaining this and giving some more examples. I add this to the Canvas course website just in case anyone wants to hear one more explanation of the fundamental attribution error. But think about this in your daily life, just how often you're explaining other people's behavior and how quickly you might be to rely on those personality attributions, those dispositional attributions. If someone did something bad, you might really jump to the fact that, oh, well, they acted that way because they're a jerk. Just think about it. All right. So that's attribution theory. That's the fundamental attribution error. So why does this matter? What are the consequences of attribution? What are the consequences of explaining other people's behavior? Well, here are a couple examples. How do you explain these behaviors? Let's say your roommate or maybe your significant other snaps at you. Let's say you jump to a dispositional attribution. Your roommate snapped at you because they're a jerk, because they're just a super angry person deep down. They've just got a black heart, and they snapped at you for no reason at all. They're just an angry person. If you explain that behavior that way, then you are likely to not have positive feelings towards your roommate. You'll probably avoid them. You might snap back at them. There might be a lot of tension, a lot of anger between the two of you, and that is going to have a negative impact on your interactions from that point onward. Now, let's say you did the opposite. Let's say your roommate or your significant other snapped at you and you explained their behavior using situational attributions. So you think to yourself, okay, they're not usually acting angry like a jerk like this. Something must be up. So you ask them, hey, are you okay? Did something happen today to make you angry? And maybe you have a conversation about something that happened that day, and that would have a much more positive outcome than if you just assumed that they're a jerk and they will be a jerk for the rest of their life. Another example, say you see a homeless person on the street. You can attribute their behavior to just a personality disposition of laziness. If that's the case, you'll be unlikely to help them, unlikely to volunteer your time at a homeless shelter or something like that. But if you explain their behavior as just a consequence of their situation, then that'll have a very different impact on how you view that homeless person. So how we attribute behavior has very real consequences. It influences our behavior and how we act towards that person. This also has some pretty real world applications in the political system. So we've got two different quotes here at the bottom of the slide. The first one, people should pull themselves up and be responsible for their own success. This type of idea, this would be more on the conservative side of the political spectrum, and that has some very real consequences for how legislatures on the conservative side and voters on the conservative side of the spectrum will vote, and policies that get passed and how public funds are used. If homelessness is seen as a personal failing, as something that is due to laziness or stupidity, then there will be less empathy and less public pressure to help those people. The second quote there, the institutions and situations that people have to deal with put them at a disadvantage for being successful. This would be a quote that better encapsulates the more liberal side of the political spectrum. Someone who might ascribe to this quote would probably be more willing to help use federal funds to help homeless people. They might think that this is not something that they did to themselves. This is at least partly due to the social situations that they were raised in. They may have been raised in an underprivileged or disadvantaged household, and that set them up for it did not set them up for success later in life. So these two quotes kind of represent different approaches. One would attribute homelessness more towards personality attributions, and one would attribute homeless behavior, more towards situational attributions. I'm certainly not saying one is right, one is wrong, but the point that I'm trying to make is that how we explain other people's behavior, how we attribute someone else's behavior, has an impact on our behavior after that. All right, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about how attributions influence attitudes. So, how we explain other people's behavior will affect our attitude. What is an attitude? Our attitudes are feelings that predispose our reactions to objects, people, or events. So attitudes are feelings that predispose our reactions to things. So if you think poor people are lazy, are you likely to help poor people? Probably not. If you hate exercising, are you likely to exercise? Probably not. If you say to yourself, I don't really like John, he's kind of a jerk, are you likely to hang around John? Probably not. If you think to yourself, I think the danger of smoking is exaggerated, are you likely to try smoking? Well, maybe, definitely more likely than someone who thinks that smoking is dangerous. So our attitudes are going to have an influence on our behavior. And remember, our attitudes are influenced by those attributions. So we've kind of got this relationship, this like chain reaction relationship going on. Attributions influence attitudes, attitudes influence behavior. So attitudes significantly influence actions. Think about some of the major public health and safety campaigns that you've been exposed to in your lifetime. Uh, Things like the anti-smoking campaigns that you might see commercials for on television, or even commercials on YouTube or Instagram or whatever. Those are like huge publicly funded campaigns to try to reduce the amount of smoking and tobacco consumption that goes on in our society. And they have shown to be effective. Um, if we can change how people think about smoking, if we can make them focus on the negative health impacts that it has, that will cause people to have more negative attitudes towards smoking in general, and therefore reduce the amount of smoking that goes on. Now remember, attitudes are malleable, they are changeable. The big question here, and this is something that a lot of social psychologists put a lot of effort into, is answering this one question: how do we change them? How do we change attitudes? We know they're changeable. We know that they significantly influence our actions. So, how do we change attitudes? How do we make people think that smoking is bad? Well, we have two main routes to persuasion, two main ways that we're going to talk about to change attitudes. The first is the central route to persuasion. The central route to persuasion is that sort of logical, fact-based, data-driven approach. This is where we seek out and analyze information about a topic. So going back to the smoking example, what are the health effects of smoking? If you seek out information and sources that give you quality information about the impacts of smoking, that would be an example of the central route to persuasion. You're looking for facts and figures and data. Going back to the poverty example, what are the main causes of poverty? If you seek out high quality information and you analyze that information, you spend time, you use logic and reasoning to digest the information, that is an example of the central route to persuasion. Now, the pros and cons of the central route to persuasion. The pros: if change occurs through the central route to persuasion, that change tends to be long lasting. It's not permanent, but it's long lasting. The con is that the central route to persuasion takes a lot of effort. You have to be motivated to change in the first place, or at least open to the idea of change in the first place. That is a surprisingly difficult thing to do. So that's the central route to persuasion, and that's in contrast to the peripheral route to persuasion. The peripheral route to persuasion is sort of just the opposite. This is where incidental cues lead to emotional judgments. So incidental cues, these are kind of like surface level pieces of data. We'll give some examples here to make this a little more clear. So with the issue of immigration, if you think that immigrants are unsafe, that is sort of one of those emotional snap judgments. That is a very easy emotional argument to make, and it does not necessarily rely on facts, figures, and data. It's sort of an emotional way to persuade someone and their attitude on that particular topic. Going back to the smoking example, the peripheral route to persuasion, you see it in movies and TV shows. Well, not so much today, but as little as 10 years ago, smoking was all over TV and movies, and that was a hugely successful marketing campaign by tobacco companies to make it look cool, and they definitely succeeded. So that would be the peripheral route to persuasion to encourage someone to smoke. It's so cool. All the bad boys in the movies smoke. The pros and cons listed at the bottom of the slide. The cons are that this is usually relatively short-term change. So if you're able to persuade someone's attitude based on the peripheral route to persuasion, it's usually temporary. The pros, though, it's very easy. It's very easy to do. You can do it in as little as a 20-minute or a 20-second commercial. And that happens all the time with advertisers. They're trying to make you associate, their product with something that's cool and flashy and sexy, and you'll think that the product is cool and flashy and sexy, and you'll be cool and flashy and sexy if you own that product. That's the peripheral route to persuasion. All right, some examples here on this slide. We've got, the flashy red sports car, and this is something that advertisers do all the time. They try to associate their products with sex appeal. So you've got the flashy red sports car, and you've got the sexy bikini model. The idea or the implication being that if you own this product, you will get whatever it is they're trying to associate with that product. I love this picture here. Santa smokes Lucky Strike. This is back when smoking advertisements were running wild. I don't know exactly what they're trying to imply here, but if Santa smokes Lucky Strike, well, geez, I guess Lucky Strike is good enough for me. And then this is referencing all the anti-smoking advertisements and campaigns that you've probably been exposed to over the last few years. And again, they're successful. They're relying a little bit on the peripheral route to persuasion and a little bit on the central route to persuasion. There's a lot of information out there showing the negative impacts of climate change. That again is also relying on the central and peripheral route to persuasion. This picture right here would be an example of the peripheral route to persuasion. You've got this poor lonely polar bear on this tiny little ice chunk all by himself, maybe not able to find much food in that kind of situation. And then on the right here, we've got two very famous political figures. We've got Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. We love to think that political debates and political arguments are based on the central route to persuasion, that we make informed political decisions on who we vote for based on facts and data and well thought out logical arguments. But unfortunately, the reality is that we often make our political decisions based on the peripheral route to persuasion. We make our political decisions based on those emotional snap judgments. Really wish that wasn't the case, but that is the reality that we live in. All right, so we've established that attitudes can be changed, and we can do that using the central route or peripheral route to persuasion. So those attitudes have an influence on our actions, but what about the opposite? Can our actions influence our attitudes? So kind of a backwards question here. We know that attitudes influence actions, but is the opposite true? Can how we act, how we behave, influence how we think? And the answer here is yes, absolutely. So let's talk about a couple examples here. First up is the foot in the door phenomenon. And this is one of those wonderfully named psychological phenomenon. The foot in the door, I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. The idea is if you just get your foot in the door, oftentimes, people will help you out, or, you can kind of make a name for yourself if people just give you a second of their time. So this is research from the mid 60s, and the researchers went out into a neighborhood and they kind of just wanted to test and see how much homeowners would let them get away with. And so they had this idea to post up signs in people's front yards that simply said, "Drive carefully." And these were big fancy houses. It was a neighborhood that probably had an HOA or something like that. So, kind of well-to-do, wealthy people, the idea of putting a sign in your front yard, it might have ruined the aesthetic of the place. So homeowners were probably a little hesitant to do something like this. So they knew they had to persuade them in a little way here. So the researchers went out into the neighborhood, they knocked on doors, and they asked people, hey, can we put this sign in your front yard? And there's two different groups here. Some of the researchers asked, we'll just put this tiny little sign, nobody will notice it. It'll have a huge impact on how people drive. People drive much safer, much slower. It'll be a great thing for the whole neighborhood. So here's a little example of that little sign. Just a tiny little sign. Doesn't really ruin the aesthetic. It's right on your fence. No one will notice it, but it'll still slow people down. So some people were asked to hang this small sign, and some people were asked to hang a big sign. It was huge. It took up, a lot of room, a lot of real estate in the front yard. It was kind of an eyesore, totally ruined the aesthetic. So there's two different groups here. Some people were asked to hang the small sign, and they let it hang there for a week. And then the researchers came back and they were asked, hey, can we now hang up this big sign? 76% of the homeowners said yes to the big sign if they had already said yes to the small sign. Now, the other group of researchers, they skipped the small sign. They jumped right to the big sign, and they asked the homeowners, hey, can we hang this big eyesore of a sign in your front yard? If that was the case, only 17% of homeowners agreed to that. So what's going on here? If you jump right to the big task, the big request, people usually say no. But if you start with a small task, a small request, people are much more likely to say yes to a big task or a big request later on. This is the foot in the door phenomenon. And the idea here is to start with a small request before you ask for a big request. If you jump right to a big request, people are just likely to say no right off the bat. You kind of establish a rapport, you establish a relationship. So in this way, our attitude or our actions can influence our attitudes. So our action of saying yes to the small task makes us more likely to say yes to the big request. All right, another way that the foot in the door phenomenon kind of influences our behavior. So back in the mid 20th century, when it was still sort of rare for women to be in the workplace, when women were just starting to enter the workplace and it was becoming more common, there was a lot of sexist backlash to this. There was a lot of men in the workplace who thought, this wasn't their place. This is wrong. Women belong at home. Back in that domestic sphere of, changing diapers and washing clothes and staying in the kitchen, that sort of nonsense. So when women first entered the workplace, there's a lot of research on this done. And what they found is that at first, men were kind of outright sexist and they thought this was totally unfair. They thought this was outrageous. They thought that, this is not the way things should be. Women should stay at home. Fast forward a few years, and men's attitude had changed pretty dramatically. They thought, it's not so bad. It's okay. They're actually good workers. I guess this can continue. It's not that bad of a thing. Same thing with racial desegregation. Back in the 60s, when desegregation first started occurring, a lot of racist people said similar things. This is outrageous. This is unfair. This is not their place. This is not the way it should be. And then same story. Fast forward a few years, lo and behold, those attitudes had changed. Views on desegregation had improved dramatically. All it took was a couple years of it to happen. So what is going on here? We've got this initial huge backlash to these changes in society. And then after those changes are put in place, we have this, albeit reluctant acceptance, but we have acceptance. So what is going on? And yeah, that, yeah, this, I'm going to stop on this slide here. I'm reaching my 30-minute max here. So people started saying to themselves, I'm not being forced